following a meeting with the Swiss President, Angela Merkel called for the EU to remain calm after a controversial referendum decision curbing immigration. With me in the studio to discuss the possible implications of this result is Daniel Warner. Daniel, thank you so much for coming in today.
Nice to be here.
Great to have you. Now, we're talking about this referendum. The interesting thing is it seemed to take quite many people by surprise. What led the Swiss people to this decision, do you think?
I think there are several things. First of all, there's a relatively high rate of unemployment. It's difficult to say unemployment in Switzerland, but there is a high rate. Housing is a problem, security is a problem, and I think most of all, there's been an increase in the number of foreigners in Switzerland. It's probably over 20% now. And I think certain people were afraid about national identity.
Okay. Now that is one of the things, but do you think were you expecting this? Was it a surprise to you?
There have been other surprises in Switzerland. There was a referendum on minarets, and everyone thought it would lose, but it won. Yes, I was surprised, but maybe that's because I live in Geneva and I have a different point of view from people who live in other places in Switzerland.
What does it really say about Swiss politics to you?
I mean, there's certain dramatic things here. Mm-hmm. All of the major Swiss parties, except one, were against it. All of the government people were against it. The Swiss economy people, business people were against it. So those people have to say, what kind of leadership do we have if we were against the referendum and it worked?
And one of the interesting things that I've been told is that people in cantons where there are no foreigners were the ones who kind of voted for it. Elsewhere, people with foreigners were quite happy with the way things are. So that's an interesting fact in itself.
Switzerland is a rather complicated country. There are 3 cultures and 3 national languages. The vote was very clear. French-speaking part against, German-speaking part for, except for the big cities Basel and Zurich and St. Gallen. Also, you have the cities were generally against and the countries were for. So this is part of what makes Switzerland so cosmopolitan but so complicated.
Now, one of the implications could be the effect it has on the European single market. What do you think? What are you expecting from this?
Switzerland had a very privileged relationship with the EU. Switzerland's not a member, but it was allowed to have free circulation of people. It has lower tariffs on its exports, and of course it has certain intellectual academic exchanges. All of those are being called into question because the free movement of people is really the basis of the EU and its philosophy.
Now, what about in terms of the Swiss economy? Is it going to have a dramatic effect on, growth, on the Swiss economy thriving in the way that it has been?
Well, if I knew what the answer to what's the relationship between Switzerland and the EU going to be, that would be helpful. If I knew the answer to your question, I would be either buying francs or selling francs. It's difficult to say. There is going to be a limit set on the number of foreigners. In Geneva, for example, about half the people who work in the local hospital are foreigners. If they stop that, or they make fewer foreigners, then everyone's going to be in trouble as far as health care. So it's difficult to say what the final solution will be. As you said, Mrs. Merkel tried to calm everyone down and said we will be pragmatic. Whether that will happen or not, we don't know.
Yeah, there has been a suggestion also that Brussels may use Switzerland as an example to kind of deter other nations or other countries from entering their own negotiations. What do you make about that? Well,
that's correct. I mean, certainly England would be, the United Kingdom would be the perfect example. Mm-hmm. But in a sense, people are saying Switzerland is xenophobic, but polls tell us that if the same referendum would take place in France, probably 60% of the people would vote the same way. During economic hard times, people tend to close down and say it's all foreigners who are taking our jobs. Whereas in Switzerland, most of the foreigners, or a lot of them, have very, very high-end kind of jobs and great institutions such as the University of Geneva or the EPFL in Lausanne. A lot of the professors, a lot of the researchers come from outside of Switzerland.
And what about the sort of best and worst case scenarios here? What could be the implications and how far reaching could they be for businesses, for the economy, etc.?
I mean, the first thing the EU did was to stop something called Horizon 2020 and Erasmus. Both of them deal with intellectuals. That's not business. One of the things that can happen would be that businesses or people exporting into the EU, tariffs would be raised, and the EU is the biggest trading partner with Switzerland. Another thing that could happen would be that companies that are based in Switzerland would not be able to get work permits for their employees. Switzerland's comparative advantage has always been stability. This is something that doesn't help the stability, and you add this to the problem with bank secrecy, you add to that the problem of executive pay, and Switzerland is not the kind of paradise that it was before.
It seems as though Switzerland, it's a big year for Switzerland, and it seems to be in the headlines for kind of all the wrong reasons this year so far.
There are some positive things. Switzerland is now president of the OSCE.
True.
Switzerland will probably be involved in negotiations in Ukraine. Switzerland still represents the United States and Iran. So there are still positive things. And remember, if you compare the Swiss economy with the economies in Italy, well, not Germany would be an exception, but France and other European countries, Switzerland is doing extremely well, something that the Swiss people perhaps don't realize.
In many respects, it could almost be too good to be true. But Daniel, thank you so much for coming in today, talking it through with us. We could talk for hours, but it's been a pleasure hearing your insights.
It was my pleasure too. Thank you.
Well, that's all from Daniel and myself for the moment. Make sure you click back to Dukascopy TV for many more exclusive interviews, press reviews and much, much more. Goodbye for now.